In the last video, I began exploring the entity, if you will, that is the Rensselaer. No. I like you saying. Just as I was saying that, he drops out. Thank you, Tissy. In the previous videos, there's been a lot of focus and attention on the Troy City Council's approval of replacing the Planning Commission with a planning board at the request of the administration. And in this exploration, in the past couple videos that I have been kind of tracking this issue, if you will, as it's kind of progressed through the weeks, I've found a lot of, it's been very interesting to follow along. It's okay. We'll edit this together so that it's a little bit more pithy than this. I mean, maybe I'll just restart this and do it again. I guess there are a couple things happening here, and I'm trying to keep them relatively organized. So I don't know that I'm going to use that particular, but it's at least getting me into the flow of talking about this. So in the last video compilation, I partially explored where I'm coming from in this particular video currently ties back to the prior videos where I have explored the City of Troy's replacement of the Planning Commission with a planning board. And within that exploration, there was curiosity here about this county influence, because the county's influence is now included in amended language that creates the planning board. And so I found that really curious because that was not in the initial language creating the planning board. It was only in the amendment after considerable, lengthy public comment that did not seem to inquire or catalyze any sort of quote-unquote need and request, suggestion, recommendation for any county participation within the city planning board. So because that arose as part of the amended language, I felt a curiosity around who is even on this county planning entity. And the planning entity, according to this amended language, doesn't even necessarily connect specifically to Rensselaer. It leaves it rather vague. However, I just felt a draw specifically to Rensselaer because Troy is within Rensselaer County. And so I did a little bit of, I explored this a little bit in the last video. And while I was exploring it in the last video, and while I was editing that video, so many more questions were coming through that I didn't explore. And part of this felt connected to the Troy signaling and telegraph building that was showcased in the last video because of the questions around the planning board. And the only reason that they really connected in that last video was because while I was searching on Google Maps for this location of the planning board, and as I was searching on Google Maps, as I was searching around this building on Google Maps, I came upon this Troy the Troy Signaling and Telegraph building, which seemingly is unconnected. At least during the last video, I sort of looked at them as unconnected, except that they are abutting each other on the block. And I realized when I came upon this Troy Signaling building in the last video that it was a building that I had stumbled upon months ago, probably going on 6 months to a year ago. I stumbled upon this building, and I don't consciously recall how or why I stumbled into it, but I just remembered that it really impacted me at the time that I did stumble upon it. But since that point, I forgot about it. And so it wasn't until I was searching on Google Maps during the last video that it re-emerged in the conscious awareness here and sparked this desire to take a little bit of an adventure and go to that location within Troy to not only capture the present state of the signaling and telegraph building. I also wanted to explore the government, the county government building, to gauge whether it's open to the public, and if it is open to the public, and even if it wasn't, I had curiosity around what information I could find around a planning entity, more than what was available just through a Google search, because the Google search felt a little bit confusing and not quite clear, except for pointing towards that particular building. So while I was editing the last video, I went on that adventure and explored the area immediately surrounding that building. I took a look at that construction area that I also pointed toward in the last video that sort of also abuts the government building. And then I took a look at the the signaling and telegraph building footprint, where it used to be. I wanted to give a little bit of a preface to these video clips that sort of tie into the last video, kind of it segues into this, and it continues to unfold. I'm finding that it continues to unfold in really curious and interesting ways. One of which is, and perhaps I'll explore this a little bit more, but quite honestly, I feel a little bit at a current dead end. But one of the interesting things that is landing a bit strangely with me at the moment is, I think it was right before I went on this little excursion, went on this little adventure to the government building, I started Google searching the telegraph and signaling building again because I wanted to see what information there was about its demolition. And what I found really strange is there were, in the Google search, about 2 articles only that I could find regarding the demolition. And even the Wikipedia article around it had no mention of the demolition, which occurred in January of 2022. And the demolition itself, the circumstances around the demolition are landing very strangely with me, landing very curiously. And this isn't intended to project a conspiracy theory, or what is sort of framed as a conspiracy theory. But I do find it very curious because what I do consciously recall about initially looking and stumbling upon this telegraph building months ago was that there was more extensive information regarding its demolition. I don't recall specifically what those articles were. I wish that I had the history in my computer to go back and look at, but apparently the history only saves the last 90 days, and this goes back well beyond the 90 days. So I don't have that anymore. But as far as I can consciously recall, the information that was present via Google search, the initial time I stumbled upon this building, it was more expansive and vast than what currently exists from what I have so far searched as a follow-up. So I found that very curious. I might go back and read these articles, but one of the articles that comes up through the Google search is a Union Times article. And Union Times is another local news outlet, media source. According to that article, the timing and the motivation behind the demolition of that building is rather sort of quote-unquote suspect. And it was at the direction of the county. So the county of Rensselaer directed this demolition. And the interesting thing about it is the demolition occurred on January 6th, if I'm remembering correctly. January 6th, 2022, which was a Tuesday. According to this article, the permit submitted to the city for the demolition grant was that Monday, December 5th. So the permit was submitted and approved, and the building was demolished all essentially within a day. And this article was quoting some of the legislators, and they were commenting about how there wasn't prior notice, there wasn't much public awareness around the intentionality of demolishing this building, let alone the actual action of it, the realization of it. And so it's very unclear why this building was demolished. And quite honestly, this whole narrative and this whole sort of story around the telegraph building, this is not per se about the demolition of the building. Although I will say, as a side note, it does pull at my heartstrings quite a bit. It was a beautiful building. I understand that it was assessed by the city engineer as I am using this word. I don't believe it was used in the article, but I am using the word irreparable structurally, that it was a safety hazard, the structure in and of itself. And so I can understand the desire to address that. But there's a sort of running theme here in terms of this demolition and the means by which the Planning Commission was replaced. This sense and this observation that the way it's gone about, that there's this feeling of pushing something through simply to get something accomplished, to complete something, if you will. It doesn't feel workable. There's something within the means by which realization occurs that feels very incoherent, and I know I'm kind of rambling on. I really didn't want this to be 20 minutes or longer, so I'm kind of hoping in the editing process that I'm able to like kind of consolidate this a bit more, because I'm running on 25 minutes. I have the last video, which I don't know that I'm going to use any of that of. But all this really just to say that I found it very interesting in reading the Times Union article that the county planning, that the county was involved in the demolition of this particular building. And it felt like there were red flags being thrown up. It felt very, in reading this article, in leaning into this experience of demolishing this building, it felt like it was completely rushed. And again, similar to the experience with the replacement of the city planning commission with the board, there's something that just feels very off about it and unworkable. And to have the city amended planning board language specifically include the green light for county officials to participate in the board feels a bit curious to me. It feels curious. And so I wanted to take a look at this building. I wanted to see what kind of public access there was. I wanted to get information about any kind of planning entity that may or may not exist. And I wanted to see where the Telegraph building used to stand and what currently exists in that footprint. So this is a bit of a preface to the video clips that I'm about to input here, showing this exploration into that particular physical landscape, building, and footprint. So we'll see how this continues to unfold. There's a bit more digging I want to do into the county planning entity, coming on the heels of what I was exploring in the last video, because there are a couple unanswered questions that came to me as I was going through the editing process of that last video that are now segueing into this current video. So I wanted to continue pulling a little bit at that thread and seeing what comes of it. So we'll see. Made it to the building. Okay, so I'm at the end of the road that led to that signaling building. So you can see this empty space right here. This is where the building was. Now it looks like it's just a parking lot. after that excursion, I thought, why not stop in for a famous lunch? Let's get it going here. Let's see. Okay, so I wanted to start off with this article, which is one of the two that I was able to find through Google in, about the, so it's the fire alarm, telegraph, and police signaling building. So this article is by Suzanne Spellen, who I believe is she may work for one of the museums here in Troy, the Hart Cluett Museum, which is right downtown. She is very historically knowledgeable. She might be the executive or the CEO of the museum. I don't recall exactly what her position is officially, but okay, this is editing Samantha. And I just had to quickly jump in here because as I'm editing and rewatching this particular clip, I felt pulled to clarify, to quickly confirm on Google whether Suzanne Spellen is the executive director of the Hart Cluett. And when I looked it up, I came to find and sort of remember that Suzanne is not the executive director. I confused her for Kathy Sheehan, but Suzanne Spellen was on the Troy Planning Commission before it was repealed and replaced with the Planning Board. And so I just found that information and was rather blown away. It's funny to me how that didn't really come through when I was first contemplating on that, or when I was first reflecting on it, and that didn't really click in my mind, and it didn't even click to look it up until this moment. And in this moment I just feel almost euphoric, but like a nervous euphoric, shocked and surprised and yet elated at the same time. So it's just a mixture of feelings, but I just wanted to jump in and clarify that via video rather than just sort of a textual insert. So just continues to be more and more interesting. And so this is her blog, I suppose. And it's not specifically just about the telegraph building. So I'm going to just kind of scroll on down to that particular section here. Okay, so here it is. So here's the building. This is one of the articles that I do remember reading months ago when I initially stumbled upon this building. This was one of the articles that I read. Yeah, last week. So this article was December 19th. December 19th. But I thought the demolition was January. Maybe it was December. Maybe I misspoke. Maybe it was... Let me look real quick. Okay, it is December. It is December. Okay, so when I go to edit that and I say January, it's not January, it's December. Okay, thank you. Okay, so I misspoke in the prior recording. I said it was January 6th of 2022. It's December 6th of 2022. So so when she wrote this article, December 19th, she's referring to the demolition that occurred December 6th, at least according to the Union Times article. Yeah, the county. An emergency demo permit. Rumor has it that the county will use the site for a parking lot, and that is exactly what it is. It's unclear why it was an emergency. Yeah, there's just very little. Yeah, so this mixed-use apartment complex is where that construction is in the video clips. And that too is right next to abutting the Rensselaer County government building. And right across the street from the city station buildings that currently exist. Yeah, it doesn't have anything about its demolition. It's just so bizarre. Yeah, Wikipedia doesn't have anything about its demolition. Here's a Times Union article. Nothing. Here's Sue's article. Nothing. There's nothing about its demolition. It's just so bizarre. Okay, so there are a couple interesting things about the planning structure and the organization in and of itself that called to me as I was editing the last video. And so I wanted to kind of segue there to just tap those roots. Is that a proper phrase? To tap into that flow. I think the last time I was looking at this organizational structure as part of the last video, I was sort of in this place of not really feeling super focused, and I was feeling a bit annoyed, quite frankly, perhaps to some degree correlated with the recall of the Telegraph building and the demolition of that building, which on a personal note is very disheartening. And so it just kind of hit me. And while I was kind of exploring a bit of this structure, I just wasn't as focused. And then when I was editing, I noticed that down here on the bottom, there's this acronym URS. And I wasn't quite sure what that was. So we have sort of two groups that together create this structure, the core planning group and a series of these jurisdictional assessment teams. And it seems like the jurisdictional assessment teams are, they kind of filter through the more individualized communities. So each sort of individualized community, if you will, acts as a jurisdictional assessment team. At least that's the way that I'm kind of understanding this. And then that kind of funnels up into what is a core planning group. But I wasn't quite sure what this URS was. And there's nothing on this planning committee organizational structure website or text that identifies that at all. It's not identified in this kind of more fleshed out graph. So we can see here that this core planning group is made up of these participating jurisdictions. So these participating jurisdictions, a representative, and what I also found interesting here is the use of the term alternate. So representative and alternate from JAT, which is the participating jurisdiction, the assessment team, the jurisdictional assessment team. So there's a representative and an alternate from a jurisdictional assessment team within the participating jurisdiction. So that sort of unit conducts outreach to the public and other stakeholders within jurisdictional boundaries. And then those units together compose the core planning group. And the core planning group then, I suppose, reports to, if you will, RCBPS, which is some kind of Rensselaer County entity. I don't know what BPS stands for. maybe Bureau of Public Safety? Yeah, okay, Rensselaer County Bureau of Public Safety. So we have this core planning group composed of these jurisdictional assessment teams, which really is the representative and alternate. And why alternate really speaks to me is because of the specific use of that language, alternate, within the amended language of the Troy Planning Board. So part of what the amendments added to the language of the planning board code is the inclusion of alternates. And so I just kind of found that really interesting, and perhaps a bit correlative. Like, are they using the county as a model? I'm not sure if other counties, other localities, other communities, other states, other jurisdictions use the same terminology. I'm not currently privy to that information consciously. Then we have, coming off of this Rensselaer County Bureau of Public Safety, this two-way arrow pointing to the URS team. And it's also included in this triangular graph, URS, and it's unclear from this text what URS is. URS team. And then kind of finally, if you will, it all sort of culminates into this planning committee. So that was one of the first kind of emergence of more information that came through as I was editing the last video. And I had thoughts around possibly including it in that video because it was so related, but I felt more so that this was perhaps for the inclusion in the following video, in the next video. So I found that really strange, and I wanted to look into this URS more. So in looking up URS within this website, because it seemed like perhaps there was some other site within the Rensselaer County site that I could find URS. And ultimately what I sort of came upon, let's see if I can find it, was another graph that actually replaced URS. It might be here. I think it's here. Because it's the same graph, it's just updated. Where did I find it? Oh! Okay, so ultimately, honestly, I don't actually recall exactly how I got here while I was looking this up. I had this saved as part of my Chrome, as a browser tab. I left this open because I knew I was going to come back to it. So I don't recall exactly how I landed here, but I saw that this is the same graph. This is the same fleshed out graph of this planning, of this county planning committee, but instead of having URS team, it now says AECOM team. And this is part of the hazard mitigation plan. And as far as I remember, this planning committee organizational structure, it specifically points to this Rensselaer County Multi-Jurisdictional Hazard Mitigation Planning Committee. And this is part of the reason why I wasn't quite sure. I don't recall if I said it in the last video. I know I commented on this to a degree at some point, but it wasn't certain to me, and it still isn't quite certain to me whether this planning committee is a planning committee and or the planning committee intended by the language in the amended Troy Planning Board language when it comments on a planning committee or a planning board, however it's phrased. It's not clear what the intention of that is, which is part of why I was exploring this, because as I started exploring it, it sort of became less and less clear what the county planning entity even is. And so this is kind of the closest. Okay, so before I keep going, I want to make a quick distinction here, because from the exploration in the last video and the exploration of the building itself in the prior video clips, what I came to find is something called the, let's see if I can find it. Okay, so I wanted to make this distinction. Because as I've been exploring this county planning entity, or just the idea of a county planning entity, there are two that I have found, and they seem to be distinct groups, at least as far as I can tell. That may be inaccurate. One that I have found is this Rensselaer County Multi-Jurisdictional Hazard Mitigation Planning Committee. This committee is included within the County Department of Public Safety. And it struck me as a bit odd, only because it has this phrasing of hazard mitigation. So that to me strikes as more environmentally related than it does sort of comprehensive city planning in a property management sense. Now, they're not wholly, absolutely mutually exclusive, but there is a bit of a distinction between this committee and Rensselaer County Planning Agency, which has connection with this Rensselaer County Economic Development and Planning. It's unclear to me currently what the connection is between this County Economic Development and Planning entity and the Multi-Jurisdictional Hazard Mitigation Planning Committee. But to go back to this URS, what I found is that URS is to some extent correlated with this AECOM team. So AECOM, Clifton, New Jersey, acted as the plan development consultant providing hazard mitigation planning services and authored the document. This document that was published as of, updated as of July of 2020. So Rensselaer County Bureau of Public Safety, Public Safety Building. This is the building that I went to. Oops. I guess I should put Troy. What isn't the building I went to? Interesting. The building I went to was this building. Yeah. So the building that I went to was this 1600 7th Avenue. I did not go to this 4000 Main Street address. So it kind of just seems to me like this URS referenced here is perhaps a just anonymous URL, or excuse me, anonymous acronym for some unidentified, contracted, private group that provides some kind of plan, assessment, some kind of service to the county by which the county acts. You know, maybe it gives recommendations. I have not read this. I have not read this plan. But it just seems to me like it's something contracted between the county and this private group. Following this page are the signed adoption resolutions of the county and all participating jurisdictions that have adopted this plan, authorizing municipal government staff to carry out the actions detailed herein. AECOM, the contractor responsible for providing the planning committee with hazard mitigation planning support. The plan represents the collective efforts of citizens, elected and appointed government officials, business leaders, volunteers of nonprofit organizations, and other stakeholders. That sounds a lot like it was the planning committee. Yeah, see, this seems to have to do more with like natural disasters, more kind of just environmentally influenced experiences. Whereas this is a bit more business development. When I went to the building, the government building, the only area that seemed relatively related was, I forget what it's called at the moment because I haven't looked back at it. Let me see. Yeah. The only thing that seemed relatively related was the Department of Health Engineering. I found that very strange. That framing very strange. Department of Health Engineering. But when I went up to the window and was asking them about the planning committee or board of the county, after consulting someone in the back, the woman at the counter handed me a piece of paper with just simply this information, this exact information. And that's the only information that they gave me about any kind of planning board or committee of the county. So it was very sparse. It was a relatively uninviting space. Okay, so moving on. Pivoting. Mothman. Silver Bridge collapse and the folklorization and commemoration of actual events. The social confusion and commodification of two dramatic historical events might have helped to build and sustain the famed Mothman legend. Ultimately, my argument is that the ways in which the events surrounding the Silver Bridge collapse have been commemorated and folklorized have resulted in what I term a, quote, narrative hijacking, end quote, in that the popularity of Mothman has overshadowed the actual events of the bridge collapse.
It is a cold December evening in 1967, and rush hour traffic is making its way across a bridge over the Ohio River. The bridge has been here for 39 years and has served the area as it carries US Route 35. At 1700 hours, the bridge catastrophically failed, sending traffic into the river below. The event would cast doubt on bridges in the country and show the vital need for regular inspections. America in the 1920s was feeling like it was getting smaller, as more families purchased cars for travelling around the country. As such, many different infrastructure projects are begun to make the nation's roads more convenient for people and goods to transport across the country. One of these projects was approved in 1926 to join up Ohio and West Virginia. Construction would begin on a new bridge across the Ohio River in May 1927 and will welcome its first vehicles just 1 year later. The bridge would gain the nickname the Gateway to the South, and its shiny aluminium paint lent the Point Pleasant Bridge its other name, the Silver Bridge. The bridge was designed by J.E. Grainer Company and was built by Gallia County, Ohio River Bridge Company. But the finished bridge was not the same as the original plans. Originally, when the bridge was envisioned, it was to have a more conventional wire cable arrangement, but a cheaper I-bar chain setup was employed instead. The bridge used a methodology of no redundancy but high strength in its chain links. Instead of having multiple weaker steel links, the Silver Bridge would have only a 2-link bar setup. In a multi-link setup, there are several redundancies, so if one link breaks, the others will take up the stress. But if one of the links fail in a 2-bar setup, the whole section is reliant on the other link holding the entire load. This is all very well, as it reduces weight in comparison to a conventional I-bar chain bridge, and should work if the links are properly fabricated and the maximum load on the bridge is not exceeded, which must have felt unlikely in the fairly clear roads of the 1920s inhabited by Model T Fords and small trucks. But this wouldn't always be the story as the USA embraced the automobile. Failure in any link on either side of the towers in any of the 3 chain spans would result in complete failure of the entire bridge. When completed, the bridge had a deck consisting of wood planking covered by rock asphalt, but in the 1940s was replaced by concrete-filled metal grid. In 1941, the privately owned Silver Bridge was bought by the state for $1.04 million. Between its original opening and 1941, a number of inspections were undertaken on the structure, and after state ownership, the bridge was checked over in 1959, 63, 64, 65, and 67. But these inspections were only visible, and the design of the bridge having no redundancy meant that no part of the essential chain could be dismantled for inspection. So basically, if you couldn't see any defects in your line of sight, then you couldn't repair them. And at the time, there wasn't really any non-destructive forms of inspection available. And this leads us to December the 15th, 1967. Rush hour traffic mounts up on the Silver Bridge on the evening of the 15th of December 1967. This is not unique, as it forms part of a vital arterial route in the area. A few minutes before 5 p.m, a groaning could be heard coming from the bridge. Shortly after, a loud gunshot-like sound shot out across the structure. Within seconds, the entire bridge plunged into the Ohio River, as described by one eyewitness as folding like a deck of cards. 32 cars disappeared from the bridge, and along with them 64 people. 46 of the people sent into the river would die, with 2 never to be recovered. With the bridge now recovered, investigators set out to find the cause of the collapse, as it was seemingly a healthy structure. Well, the results would reveal a horrifyingly simple flaw of just a few millimetres. Hello, this is John from the future, from when I originally recorded this script. At this point, I need to address the other theory, Mothman. In his 1970 book, Operation Trojan Horse, and in his 1975 book, The Mothman Prophecies, author John Keel linked the Silver Bridge collapse to alleged sightings of the Mothman. But again, like the aircraft theory, this is rather unlikely, and the actual cause would be, in my opinion, far more worrying: a microscopic crack. Needless to say, investigators focused back on the bridge itself. After extensive studying of the wreckage and the eye-bar links, a likely cause was discovered. But this theory wouldn't be confirmed until a 1971 safety board determination, and after extensive laboratory testing, the culprit was pinpointed. I-bar 330 at joint C13N of the north I-bar suspension chain was discovered to have a crack that looked to have progressively increased. It was thought that the crack was present during manufacture, albeit minute and practically undetectable to the naked eye. Over time, this crack succumbed to stress corrosion. This is the formation of brittle cracks in a normally sound material through the simultaneous action of tensile stress and a corrosive environment. Over the near 40-year life of the bridge, this crack continued until the point of no return. The defect was further hindered from being discovered due to the setup of the non-redundant I-bar, which meant that dismantling for inspection was unfeasible. At the time of the bridge's construction, West Virginia law prohibited the operation of any vehicle gross weight, including its load, more than 20,000 pounds. Over the years, this law would change, resulting in this weight almost tripling. The legacy of the bridge resulted in more stringent inspections and a re-evaluation of bridge design and the risks of stress corrosion.
In this case, the center of attention is on the shift in focus from the bridge to the creature. What sets commemoration apart from folklorization is that it serves a particular function, which is that a historical event is commemorated to push a narrative. McDowell makes the point that, quote, every teller has a stake in the tale, and this stake influences their take on the story, end quote. Like McDowell, I do not merely wish to recapitulate the theories of those who have come before me. Instead, I apply their theories simultaneously. The events which transpired in Point Pleasant in the late 1960s are uniquely multifaceted in that there is a historical event, the bridge collapse, but on top of that, there is a legendary creature imbued with supernatural abilities which have become the focal point of the events. I use songs, books, movies, and material forms to show how the events have resulted in an ongoing rift between the parties involved. There is a temporal shift in perspective dictated by a purpose, from the disaster to the monster, from coping mechanism to financial gain. My concept of narrative hijacking is similar to Jeannie Banks Thomas's, quote, invasive narrative, end quote, though it differs in significant ways. Thomas says that, quote, an invasive narrative is not a story that locals live by. Rather, it is a story that locals live with, whether they like it or not. The difference between the invasive narrative and a narrative hijacking is that in the case of Salem, the story of the witch trials is at the center of the narrative, whereas in the case of Mothman, the Silver Bridge collapse is, as I argue, the real point of concern, and that the legendary monster has usurped the historical event as being the point of focus. I mean, I still see how they can be sort of one and the same with an invasive narrative. Like with his, with the author's narrative hijacking, there are two perceived focal points that are considered mutually exclusive, if you will. There's the focal point of Mothman, and there's the focal point of the Silver Bridge collapse. And so there's this perception of one hijacking another or the other. Whereas with the invasive narrative, in the context of Salem, it's just the focal point of witch trials. But I can still see how there would be a hijacking, if you will, a narrative hijacking in the sense of it's more the narrative as the focal point than it is the appearance of what is happening, or what appears to be happening, if you will. So that the narrative of witch trials, kind of in line with how he is analogizing it to the bridge collapse, in sort of a more mundane, and I don't mean mundane as in boring or ordinary, I mean mundane as in earthly, quote-unquote real life. The historical, sort of factual nature of an experience being women, largely women, accused of witchcraft. And then there's the narrative that's a bit more abstract, that's a bit more unearthly, if you will. And so that narrative perhaps being women practicing witchcraft, women casting spells. So that narrative of women casting spells and practicing witchcraft, and that narrative hijacking, if you will, the focal point of the experience in a sort of more holistic sense, or just even hijacking it from another narrative of the same experience. So I don't know that it necessarily has to be two sort of perceived mutually exclusive experiences for there to be a narrative hijacking. And I'm not even saying that those different perspectives of the same experience is even a hijacking. I understand what he's saying here. I hear what he's pointing toward. It's just kind of interesting to use the framing of hijacking. However, I can see that how he's pointing to it here is more like it is generating nearly all the attention, taking over, subordinating another narrative. Who's Dixon? Dixon, who was referenced in saying that Forteanism, a school of thought that focuses on paranormal and unexplained phenomena and is a, quote, examination of the way in which anomalous events emerge into public awareness and are subsequently framed through, at times, antithetical frameworks. I don't remember what antithetical means. Directly opposed or contrasted. Mutually incompatible. Connected with, containing, or using the rhetorical device of antithesis. Okay, so an examination of the way in which anomalous events emerge into public awareness and are subsequently framed through, at times, antithetical frameworks. So he says, quote, the figure of the Mothman, then, becomes the fulcrum around which the character of truth, along with the associated constructs of reality, cause, effect, explanation, coherence, and identity are thrown into doubt. In many respects, this book hijacked the narrative from being about the disaster and the tangibility of the lives that were lost and the families that were ruined and made it about the monster. Point Pleasant was what Dixon terms an, quote, a, quote, extra geography, end quote. A space, quote, whereby the rigid spatial categorizations of cartographers and planners provoke and are on occasion overturned by flights of imaginations and fancy. This is kind of actually reminding me a little bit of the perception around conspiracy theory and conspiracy theorizing. In other words, to Keel, Mothman and the Silver Bridge were absolutely connected, and so he conflated the two. For others, however, that was certainly not the case. I don't know, does connecting two seemingly mutually exclusive events necessarily mean that you're conflating them? So it was Keel's lens, his preconceptions, and personal biases which led him to see the story of Mothman and the Silver Bridge as one and the same. A plaque commemorating the Silver Bridge collapse sits down by the riverside. It is very plain and acts as a means to remember those who lost their lives. In contrast, a huge metallic Mothman sculpture was commissioned by the Point Pleasant Main Street organization and sat in a prominent position in town. There is strife and disagreement in Point Pleasant over how this situation was handled. So while that's saving, there's a couple interesting things that are coming to me from that particular piece. One of them is this notion around conspiracy theorizing. And that notion has been coming to mind a lot over the past couple weeks. There seems to be something gravitating here around that notion, and I don't know that it feels like a ripe landscape to really contemplate very deeply on currently. It is something, though, that is relatively becoming more and more at the forefront of mind. And so it is something that there is intention to dive into a lot deeper and to really kind of flesh that out a little bit more on a energetic sort of infrastructural ontological level. So that was interesting how that kind of came through that piece. Another interesting thing that came through is just the simultaneity in perceiving an experience, and how so many different various perspectives can view what is considered sort of a same reality, same event, how there are so many infinite perspectives on a particular event, if you will, an experience, something appearing to happen, and how all those perspectives can be held simultaneously, how they don't have to necessarily contrast, they don't necessarily have to conflict, they don't have to necessarily negate one another. And as I even just said conflict, I was brought back to the sort of explorations I've been having in these videos around conflict and emergence and activation, in sort of founded in this numerical sense, and how conflict and tension to a degree kind of brings this imagery of the cell and the cell's multiplication, and how that line drawn, if you will, during the multiplication process in that emergent activation phase, if you will, how that line being drawn, there is inherent sort of conflict in that experience. And yet, I guess in a way, maybe it doesn't have to be perceived even as conflict per se, that it doesn't have to be a perception of the cell multiplying and one negating now the other, one being in contrast to the other, one being in conflict with the other. It really just juxtaposition is the word coming through. So that was just kind of an interesting thing, if you will, coming through. Just how pointing toward how possible it really is, and maybe how we already are doing it. I don't know why I said that. Anyway, was there something else that came through? I think there was something else that came through about this article. Yeah, it's kind of interesting to think about how the multiple perspectives, it's like one perspective, one narrative is prioritized, is idolized, is nearly worshipped, at the suppression and subordination of other narratives that are just as valid and just as real, within the totality, if you will, the wholeness, the holistic picture of the experience. And so that multidimensionality, simultaneously witnessed, leaves that imprint impresses the experience in a holistic sense that is holographically stored as memory within every multidimensional facet of it. So it's interesting to think of how that predominance of a narrative over the perception of others as though they're separate and mutually exclusive. And I'm not saying by mutually exclusive that they aren't per se. It's not in an absolutist sense that they are mutually exclusive, although that reality can exist. It's just that in a more holistic sense, if you will, it feels as though that clear line drawn to separate the narratives is dissolving. And not to say that there isn't independence within, not to say that there isn't individuality, not to say that there isn't uniqueness, just to say that the confinement, the sort of rigid containment, perhaps it can remain, there isn't, okay, so perhaps there is the sort of rigid containment, the rigid sort of, and I don't even know if I'd say rigid, but the individuality, the uniqueness in the expression, and yet simultaneously there is the emancipation is the word coming through, the emancipation, the liberation of that confinement by and through the realization that that confinement and that containment isn't all that there is to the picture. And so there is this simultaneous ability to capture, interesting word coming through, to experience and to realize that sort of contrast, that sort of conflict, not being conflictual, not being conflicting. So that simultaneity, that simultaneous sort of paradoxical nature within narration can perhaps open the doorway for realizing and embodying that perhaps in one's unique experience, the reality of that unique experience is real, and yet there also is a reality to there being more to the story. And that's okay, even if it's not cognitively understood, if it's not cognitively reasonable, if it's not cognitively measurable and repeatable, predictable. But simply sort of, and maybe not simply, but to some degree just explorable and curious and wonderful. And maybe that's perhaps a narrative, that's just a narrative. Out of the infinite narratives, that narrative feels a bit more inclusive and open yet closed at the same time. It feels more I don't know. Anyway. Mothman. Mothman. I heard about Mothman recently. I don't remember where, and I don't remember why. Maybe it was some fictional story I was watching, or some, I don't know what I was doing. Sleep. Good morning. There's an article, there's an essay here. There's an essay about Shakespeare that I wasn't intending to read until I had a conversation yesterday afternoon with a friend of mine, and throughout that conversation, there were these sort of synchronistic moments that sparked that desire. There were synchronicities around Shakespeare that came through that conversation, and I sort of realized even further after the conversation. And so I recalled that I had this article, and so because of the synchronicities, I felt a bit more of a pull to read this article and see if there's anything that wanted to come through. So I actually clicked onto the full PDF of the magazine in which this article was published, and the whole magazine is actually about Shakespeare. There are multiple articles. One in particular stands out to me, Shakespeare's Epistemology and the Problem of Truth. But I'm going to initially read the essay that I had put aside and was sparked, or there has been re-interest in reading. Demythologizing Shakespeare, what we really know about the man from Stratford. Many individual documents are available on websites. In general, this website provides immediate access to a wide range of materials. Most entries here offer an image and a transcription of the document. However, each entry begins with a reviewer's personal explanation of the record. That is to say, the reviewer is giving interpretation before showing evidence. Reminds me a bit of the notion of conspiracy theorizing, which is interesting because conspiracy theories, at least in observing personal conspiracy theorizing, they do tend to be based on some observations, some experiential observations that perhaps are not specifically evidentiarily cited along with the theory. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the theory is not supported by some first-hand observation. Which is also reminding me of a section of a book that I read months ago called The Metaphysical Club. It was such a good book. I had rented it from the library. I don't remember how I came to be aware of it, but I took it out of the library and I loved it so much that I bought it. And if I can try and find where what I'm referencing is in the book, I'll try and link it up here. That's going to be a little bit of a tough ask for myself, but I'll see if I can find it. It had something to do with legal it had something to do with justices in the legal field making a sort of initial determination, how there's this kind of initial quote-unquote bias, judgment perhaps, that is sensed within oneself, that is premeditated is the word coming through, but it's sort of is a almost like an initial determination that acts as, actually this is kind of interesting too, because this, what is coming to mind is a video that I watched a couple days ago that had to do with the CIA reporting on the gateway process and how the gateway process informs cognitive understanding of consciousness and alternate states of consciousness. And in that video, as far as I could understand it while I was watching, or as far as I could comprehend it, there was an attempted explanation, or at least there was information around the sort of creation of a holographic image. And in this information, there was a visualization, sort of metaphorically, of this laser beam, and how the laser beam is sort of representative of a singular frequency. So it's sort of almost representative of the singularity that when it comes into contact with some medium and is reflected through that medium, that impact, that impression is recorded on that sort of baseline singularity frequency, singular frequency, to the degree that in that reflected energy, within that reflected energy, within that reflected vibration, within that reflected frequency, there is this recorded image of that which has been reflected upon. And so in the description in the video, there was something about, and I'll try and find this more specifically, but there was something about there being this disturbance, this, I forget the word that they used at the moment, but some kind of, where a state of rest, the state of rest sort of being the singularity, that moment of rest coming into contact in a sort of physical sense, if you will, that sort of concretized moment of realization where a moment of rest comes into direct, abutting, simultaneous sort of contact with the sort of appearance of motion, and how that moment is the moment of imprint.
The first point which needs to be made is that the two terms, matter and energy, tend to be misleading if taken to indicate two distinctly different states of existence in the physical world that we know it. Indeed, if the term matter is taken to mean solid substance as opposed to energy, which is understood to mean a force of some sort, then the use of the former is entirely misleading. Science now knows that both the electrons which spin in the energy field located around the nucleus of the atom and the nucleus itself are made up of nothing more than oscillating energy grids. Solid matter, in the strict construction of the term, simply does not exist. Rather, atomic structure is composed of oscillating energy grids surrounded by other oscillating energy grids, which orbit at extraordinarily high speeds. The point to be made is that the entire human being, brain, consciousness, and all is like the universe which surrounds him, nothing more or less than an extraordinarily complex system of energy fields. The so-called states of matter are actually variances in the state of energy, and human consciousness is a function of the interaction of energy in two opposite states, motion versus rest. 12. Holograms. Energy creates, stores, and retrieves meaning in the universe by projecting or expanding at certain frequencies in a three-dimensional mode that creates a living pattern called a hologram. The concept of the hologram can be most easily understood by using an example cited by Bentov, in which he asks the reader to visualize a bowl full of water into which three pebbles are dropped. As the ripples created by the simultaneous entry of the three pebbles radiate outward towards the rim of the bowl, Bentov further asks the reader to visualize that the surface of the water is suddenly flash frozen, so that the ripple pattern is preserved instantly. The ice is removed, leaving the three pebbles still laying at the bottom of the bowl. Then the ice is exposed to a powerful, coherent source of light, such as a laser. The result will be a three-dimensional model or representation of the position of the three pebbles suspended in midair. The whole concept of holography, despite its scientific implications, has only been known to physicists since the underlying mathematical principles were worked out by Denis Gabor in 1947. He later won a Nobel Prize for his work. Laboratory demonstration of Gabor's work only occurred years later following the invention of the laser, as biologist Lyle Watson explains. The purest kind of light available to us is that produced by a laser, which sends out a beam in which all the waves are of one frequency, like those made by an ideal pebble in a perfect pond. When two laser beams touch, they produce an interference pattern of light and dark ripples that can be recorded on a photographic plate. And if one of the beams, instead of coming directly from the laser, is reflected first off an object such as a human face, the resulting pattern will be very complex indeed, but it can still be recorded. The record will be a hologram of the face. 13. The part encodes the whole. Of further importance is the fact that even if we dropped our frozen hologram of the ripple pattern on the floor and broke it into a number of pieces, each individual piece would recreate the entire holographic image all by itself. The smaller the piece, the fuzzier and more distorted would be the resulting holographic projection. But the fact remains that a whole projection would nonetheless be made. The key to creating any hologram is that the energy in motion must interact with energy in a state of rest, or non-motion. In the foregoing example, the pebbles represent energy in motion, while the water, before its agitation by the pebbles, represents the energy at a state of rest. To activate, or in effect, to perceive the meaning of a holograph, energy, in this case a coherent light source such as a laser beam, must be passed through the interference pattern generated by the interaction between the moving energy and the energy at rest. In the simple example given by Bentov, this requirement was fulfilled by holding the frozen interference pattern in front of the coherent light to project the three-dimensional holographic image, its meaning, into space. As Marilyn Ferguson, editor of the Brain Mind Bulletin, tells us, another feature of a hologram is its efficiency. Billions of bits of information can be stored in a tiny space. The pattern of the holographic photograph is stored everywhere on the plate. 14. The consciousness matrix. The universe is composed of interacting energy fields, some at rest and some in motion. It is, in and of itself, one gigantic hologram of unbelievable complexity. According to the theories of Karl Pribram, a neuroscientist at Stanford University, and David Bohm, a physicist at the University of London, the human mind is also a hologram which attunes itself to the universal hologram by the medium of energy exchange, thereby deducing meaning and achieving the state which we call consciousness. With respect to states of expanded or altered consciousness, such as gateway uses, the process operates in the following way. As energy passes through various aspects of the universal hologram, and is perceived by the electrostatic fields which comprise the human mind, the holographic images being conveyed are projected upon those electrostatic fields of the mind, and are perceived or understood to the extent that the electrostatic field is operating at a frequency and amplitude that can harmonize with, and therefore read, the energy carrier wave pattern passing through it. Changes in the frequency and amplitude of the electrostatic field, which comprises the human mind, determine the configuration and hence the character of the holographic energy matrix, which the mind projects to intercept meaning directly from the holographic transmissions of the universe. Then, to make sense of what the holographic image is saying to it, the mind proceeds to compare the image just received with itself. Specifically, it does this by comparing the image received with that part of its own hologram, which constitutes memory. By registering differences in geometric form and in energy frequency, the consciousness perceives. As psychologist Keith Floyd puts it, contrary to what everyone knows is so, it may not be the brain that produces consciousness, but rather consciousness that creates the appearance of the brain.
I don't remember why I brought this up, but it had something to do with how here this interpretation before showing evidence and this sort of default kind of judgment and the legal sort of predetermined, if you will, conclusion. I know why I was bringing up the legal thing, but I don't know why that reminded me of the singularity and frequency and hologram. Actually, this is also kind of reminding me of the numerical sense again. And perhaps there is something to this singularity as a baseline, and as it continues, as there is this continuing impressionistic appearance of motion in this perceived linearity and this perceived sequential emergence, that continued imprinting as this memory, this memory storage, is increasing in magnitude over time. And from that sort of very fundamental sense of the singularity, a sense of singularity, and a sense of numerical preference, this innate preference, individuated and collectively, there is this intelligence within that perhaps attunes and senses and navigates its self sort of navigation system, listens for that moment of numerical activation, numerical threshold activation, so that when it is sensed that there is sort of quote unquote enough within a body of a certain magnitude to give way to the emergence of this quote unquote sort of new phenotypic experience within the body, that's when there is this kind of openness to perceive and experience differently. And I suppose what I'm saying is, with this interpretation, and the interpretation coming quote unquote sort of before showing evidence supporting that interpretation, there is this innate sense of a belief system. There is this innate sense of what feels true within one's reality and within the reality of a collective body. The interpretation, and I know I've kind of touched a little bit on various lenses of interpretation, literal, textual, metaphorical, sort of allegorical, moral, and anagogical. Or excuse me, was it anagogical? Yeah, anagogical, I believe. And all of that kind of packaged together kind of lends to that perception of one's reality. And so as the perceptions of reality are experienced and continue to be reflected through and reflected upon, that sort of builds in magnitude the sort of collective and within one's individuated self, that it builds that interpretive lens. It widens that interpretive lens more and more. That lens becomes expanded and to a degree that there activates, perhaps through some numerical sense in magnitude or of magnitude, there is an emergent sort of phenotypic experience in relationships within the body and how that body then relates to its reality, if you will. And so the evidence, oftentimes there is this need for evidence to be this externalized, physical, measurable product, if you will, proof, validity, confirmation. And yet there is so much confirmation and validity that comes from within oneself, within one's body, within, whether that's the individuated and or collective body. There's so much confirmation and validation, evidence, proof that is sensed within oneself. So it's interesting to have this reliance on externalized evidence to support the interpretation's validity, the interpretation's realness. So there's a lot that I'm kind of like spewing here. But I guess sort of what feels like it's being pointed toward is just with interpretation, it's almost as though the interpretation happens beyond the cognitive assessment. It sort of comes from within oneself before showing evidence, almost as though before showing evidence is sort of the cognitive process, is sort of the cognitive piecing together, the cognitive analysis. And that's valid and that's significant in one's perception of reality and in relationship to one another. However, it's not necessarily the be-all end-all. It's not necessarily the most significant. Interpretation feels, I was going to say like it predates it, but it emerges from a space, if you will, beyond a cognitive understanding of holistic picture of evidence. I don't know. There's so much to this too, because evidence kind of like we were saying with in the last article about Mothman, and this is a phrase that is often used with witnesses, is the evidential sort of value of eyewitness accounts, and how different various perspectives of a same sort of quote-unquote event can be very various in the narratives formulated around that event, which inform one's sort of continuing interpretation. So they sort of inform one another. I understand that evidence here is sort of being used in that more material sense in reference to documentation, but even here they're talking about sort of eyewitness records of people who perhaps lived in as contemporaries. So it's just kind of interesting evidence. Yeah, I'm not really sure where I was going with interpretation, quite honestly, but there is something here too. Interpretation being beyond the cognitive narration, the sort of cognitive framework that is intending to make sense, intending to make practical, logical sense out of information. The information being inclusive of interpretation that is interwoven and intimately connected with this emerging experience of simultaneity between the singularity of all the singular landscape, if you will, this sort of blank slate, and all that emerges therefrom in reflection, through reflection, and how that over time sort of builds and constructs an inner narration that is beyond cognition and transcendent of perhaps what to a cognitive mind would make sense. It's felt, it's a felt, embodied experience that listens and remembers and recalls all that stored information as it is capable, as it is able, within the sort of frequency, the sort of energetic field, perhaps some semblance of electromagnetic energetic field that translates that information. And so how that information is translated within the body, within one's being, within one's lens, if you will, the sort of individuated lens within the collective wholeness, that sense is sort of a process of interpretation at all times. I think I'm going to read the other article. Just sitting here kind of continuing to reflect on evidence, and I started to kind of feel like there's this obsession almost. There's this obsession, and I feel it in myself just the same as many. There is this, it's almost this obsession to uncover and discover I'm intending not to use the word evidence in this expression. There's this obsession to almost grasp certainty, to grasp, to grasp certainty, but in a way that certainty, as I'm leaning into it, it feels like the uncertainty that is so desired is out of reach. So there's this intangibility to it. There's this grasping sand and watching it fall through your fingers, or grasping water and watching it flow through your fingers. And that's kind of the feeling I'm getting, is it's inaccessible, it's intangible. And that's not to say that it's intangible and inaccessible in an absolute sense. In some dimensional aspect, certainty exists, and yet there simultaneously is this unattainability. And so there is this obsession to attain that unattainable experience. But as I'm leaning into this need, this perceived need for evidence, it feels energetically to me, and leaning in, so obsessive that it almost loses sight of other forms of evidence. It becomes so narrowly focused, and it's interesting because this narrow focus, this tunnel vision, is also reminding me of that laser beam. And it's interesting because the laser beam can also be extreme in its sort of quality of experience, in that there is that tunnel vision, there is that focus, that there is a quality of focus that doesn't necessarily feel obsessive, although it has a flavor of obsession, and yet the obsession is more muted. It's almost as though the focus is driven by a force beyond a more egoic sense of obsession. And I don't mean ego here as full of oneself as the phrase coming through. I don't mean ego in a way that speaks to how one perceives themselves in a conscious way. I more refer to ego as just that contracted perception of being a person, of being a human persona. And so in that, through that lens, in that perception, there is an obsessiveness that feels very connected and interwoven with one's sense of who they are and one's sense of themselves in a reality that feels a bit separate. And so in that sort of obsessiveness, that really kind of contracted, obsessive must, because this identifies who I am, and this means something to the identity of the persona here. That kind of obsessiveness just has a very different quality to a little bit more of an expanded, liberated, and I say liberated from that very contracted sense. So it's liberated from, it's kind of like the line between a sense of oneself and sort of an externalized perception of reality that is separate, kind of dissolves, kind of falls away, it's blurred. There just is more of an obsessiveness that is guided, that feels a bit more natural, and I use these terms very loosely, but it feels more meaningful in a picture beyond that contracted sense of oneself. And so evidence evidence as is kind of standardly sort of perceived, the framework or the perception of what evidence, how we relate to evidence in this reality of kind of a modern culture, at least in the United States, the perception of what evidence is and how we then relate to what evidence is feels very contracted, feels very obsessive in that continued sort of identification of who we are, and that identification and meaning given to our experience of reality. And it must, the relationship that we have with evidence is that it must appear in a very sort of contained, clear, there's this tight grip that's put on, that's sort of projected onto the perception of evidence, the perception of what it is to be evidentiary. There's a projection because somewhere, or just there's this projection and this perceived need for that relationship, that projection to so it's just kind of interesting to think of how would the relationship in our culture, how would relationships shift? How would the relationship to evidence shift, and that quality shift, the need how would a shift in the relationship with evidence to a more innately known expression, how would that shift how the structures in how we relate to one another and how institutions express, if at all? How would that be different? How could that look different? Yeah, it's just making me think of a little bit of etymologically evidence kind of being tied to evident, it being evident. And this is not to say that the relationship that we have with evidence in its current sort of form is wrong, is bad. There is a lot of significant value to the drive and gravitation toward that discovery process. It's just that it's a discovery process that tends to focus so predominantly on externalized material experiences that are evident, that in which it is evident of something else. So it's looking at information, it's processing information in a way that in a formulated picture makes evident other information. So it's almost as though there is a bit of mutual exclusivity and simultaneously interconnection, because information being used to verify other information. It is evident in this information that this information is true. It is evident that this information validates this information, which to some degree has a sense of certainty, but it also has a sense of illusion, of insecurity, of gaps. So it's interesting how so often in how in relationships, in a sort of how in relationships there tends to be this competitive nature where the information that is put forth by this party is in conflict with the information put forth by this party. And that kind of conflicting narrative, that kind of conflictual framework prolongs the appearance of the gaps and the sensing of the gaps and the sensing of the illusory nature within the grip and grasping for certainty. if certainty is the goal, if certainty is what really matters. Is it? Is certainty, is that grip of certainty all that really matters? And I feel like that's part of that obsessive, that more contracted sense of obsession, is that belief that certainty is all that matters. That externalized evidence, that externalized evidentiary aspect within information is all that matters. I kind of feel like there's a little bit more here that wants to come out. All right, so just to continue on that riff, I just want to clarify that the sort of distinctions in quality that I was talking about with obsession and the relationship to evidence that expresses within those qualities, they don't necessarily have to be experienced as mutually exclusive. They don't necessarily have to exist one without the other. That experience beyond one's sense of self and the experience within oneself plays with certainty and uncertainty in a more fluid, mutable realm of possibility. I guess all of it to just say that there's something about evidence, there's something about the relationship to evidence that feels very constraining. And what even is evidence, and really taking a harder look, and by harder I just mean inquiring with curiosity and wonder about what kind of relationship we have to evidence, how it informs the structures of our reality, and how perhaps evidence, how we perceive evidence, the concept of evidence, and the relationship thereto, how that shifts, how that structure, the structures that inform the relationship and the relationship informing those structures, how all of that shifts when the perception and experience of evidence comes from within oneself, and simultaneously within that beyond one's sense of self. Because beyond one's sense of self, there is less of this need to grip onto a sense of certainty, a sense of materiality, externalized materiality that validates information. Because the validation, the sense of validation comes more from within, and that space within feels more rooted in a holistic picture that perhaps the mental body, which is connected more to that sense of oneself that is obsessive in that process of identification and that process of not delineation, not necessarily differentiation. Anyway, I feel like I'm like going on and on about this. I honestly really don't know. Classifying it. Yeah, it's like this quest to classify. Which is interesting because the moving beyond oneself, moving beyond that sort of constrained, contracted perception of reality, declassifies the perceptions and relationships in a way that broadens and dissolves the felt need to relate to relate to reality through classification, and sort of assumed within this classification and categorization is a sense of the validity of it, is the sense of the truth of it, the sense of, and by sense it's the perception, the experience of the validity of it, the experience of the truth of it, the experience of the evident nature of it. And so when the relationship to reality is broadened and dissolved through rooting within one's expanded sense of self, that need to classify and the need to sense the validity within that classification dissolves. And that's not to say that the egoic perception of reality dissolves completely experientially. That's not to say that classification and categorization is wrong, bad. It's not to say that it's not significant, that it doesn't have value. That process, that perception, that lens, that interpretive reflection, or that sort of reflected interpretation, lends to a classification that, or an experience of classification that feels just lightened. It feels less obsessive in that quality of needing to identify and be identified through it. And identifying with that sense of validation, identifying with that sense of evident nature, identifying as evident. The Encyclopedia Britannica defines epistemology as, quote, the philosophical study of the nature, origin, and limits of human knowledge. It's important to look at Shakespeare's epistemology in the context of his time, because early modern epistemology resembled medieval epistemology more than our own. It was built less on science than poetry. The two central subjects of the classical trivium, grammar and rhetoric. Interesting. Grammarians conceived of the world as a book written by God, which could only be interpreted by poets. When early modern writers referred to reality, they were not necessarily speaking of what we know in modern scientific terms as reality today, but instead the reality created by art. Yeah, this is interesting. For instance, there are many references to nature in Shakespeare, but these do not necessarily mean nature as we know it today. When Hamlet references to hold as the mirror up to nature, the nature Hamlet means is not the physical, realized world investigated by modern science or naturalistic novelists. Rather, nature refers to what becomes apparent only in the mirror. Nature has no discernible feature, shape, until the dramatic mirror creates it. It's interesting because the way that sort of today we would tend to read nature is rather literally, or perhaps more literally than a more subtextual inference to imply or reference the aspect of nature that isn't physically realized, that is sort of the cosmic womb that gives rise to the realized physical world. So that kind of reminds me of the lenses of interpretation, and even in how we write today in constitutional, just legal frameworks and in scientific papers. Even in the political sort of governmental arena, there is this tendency to interpret communication and information very literally. And I find literal interpretation very significant. And I also find sort of that anagogical, between the lines interpretation very significant as well. And it's interesting how incorporating multiple layers of interpretation into communication and into information can paint such a different picture and can paint such a vast landscape that totally, well, maybe not totally, but really reshifts how we experience that landscape in a more holistic sense within ourselves, because we are that landscape. And so the relationship to that landscape, when it's recognized or when it's experienced within just as much as it is without, is so profoundly wonderful. And the evident nature within the experience of that more holistic reality, if you will, is it doesn't need anything extra to be evident. It doesn't, the evident nature is inherent to it. It is inherent, it is innate. It can't help but be evident. This is also really interesting. Similarly, what early modern rhetoricians spoke of was not so much informed by what they observed about the world or its mechanisms, but instead was what was stored in the rhetorician's memory, which was an important element of rhetoric. That reminds me and points back toward that sort of holographic recall, that holographic remembrance, rememorialization, if you will. that informs itself through reflection, through introspection, a sense of wholeness beyond one's sort of contracted sense of self. That is a narrative that translates a narrative through one's sort of unique expression of that narrative. And so it is very sort of fluidly, metaphorically experienced. And over time, it feels like it's been a little bit more narrowly translated into a perception that is more literal, more constrained, more focused on the certainty, the experience of certainty within the reality of what one is living, of what one is realizing within that unique expression of the whole. And so it's almost like trying to find this certainty within uncertainty. And I say uncertainty because it's pure potentiality. Inventio. Nah, it doesn't sound too odd. It's interesting, inventio, inventing. I mean, this kind of brings me back to an earlier video where there was expression about originality. I don't recall exactly if there was mention of the specific word inventing, invention. I don't recall consciously. But it is reminding me of that expression. And inventing is also, I'm getting the visual of a volcano in that sort of ventilation, the venting from within. So it's this invent process where that cosmic womb is inventing through the conduit that is the sort of persona, that is the sort of individualized expression thereof. And so it is this inventive process that does have a sense of originality to it. And yet a sense of ancestry, a sense of history, tradition even. In fact, McLuhan suggests that as we live in a scientific world devoted to microscopes and telescopes, experimentation, argumentation, and proof, it's nearly impossible to understand early modern education. It was, okay, interesting. It was during Shakespeare's lifetime that the philosopher Petrus Ramus revolutionized epistemology by moving inventio from rhetoric to dialectics. Dialectics went on to become what we know as modern science. Interesting. Ramus yanked inventio into the real perceived world. Invention in the etymological sense to mean coming upon or laying open to view, not as creating or devising. Yeah, interesting. Right, coming upon, it's almost like inspiration laying oneself open as a conduit to view inspired thought, if you will. Inspired information. And as Miller quotes Ramus, ideas are not what they are because I discern them, but they are existing, and therefore I discern them. Plant the seeds for what is now known as the scientific method. Interesting. Unfortunately, although modern critics tackling Shakespeare's epistemology get very close to identifying his approach, they seem frightened to identify it. This is not only because Shakespeare's approach is very alien to the modern scientific method, but because it points to lesser-known Greek and Roman philosophers, whose work is considered radical even today. Critic Eric P. Levy comments on Hamlet's encounter with epistemology, concluding Hamlet is paralyzed by his discovery of ignorance. Quote, the problem of knowing in Hamlet is complicated by the intrinsic limitations of the cognitive faculty. And against this backdrop of cognitive inquiry, a more important epistemological development unfolds, a ripening awareness of that which cannot be known. This reminds me of the article by, I just remember her first name, Dana, regarding ChatGPT and unknowing. I'll link that here. It might be Levi. Eric Levi. It's either Levi or Levy. This is kind of funny. Instead of looking for ideas from Greek and Roman philosophy that might shed light on Hamlet's situation, Levi labels Hamlet's restless thinking as the ubiquitous tragic flaw. Hamlet is not stoic enough to control his relentless thinking. That kind of reminds me of that sort of obsessive nature. And I don't even just mean obsessive in an expression of research and movements to discover. I'm also sort of referencing making judgments. That the perception of not having enough proof, not having enough evidence as cause for claiming that a degree of information is not evident. Hamlet's difficulties in perception appear immediately when his father's ghost tells Hamlet that he was murdered. However, as this testimony comes from a ghost, who can be heard only by Hamlet, quote, the appearance of the ghost compels acknowledgement, within the context of the play, of dimensions of life that transcend normal experiential observation. Shakespeare valorizes the passion of faith over the calculation of reason. Yeah, it's interesting because there's sort of been a flip-flop to where the passion of reason is valorized over the calculation of reason is valorized over the passion of faith. And so it would be an interesting shifting of the infrastructure of reality where both the passion of faith and the calculation of reason are valorized, are on that equal playing field, informing one another, encouraging one another. Dare I say, loving one another in a partnership. Shakespeare is more interested in the ineffable than the observable. It was not so much that Shakespeare believed that truth and knowledge were a matter of faith, as that he was deeply interested in those truths which are more elusive, i.e., that evade both careful observation and the rigors of factual investigation. He's sort of a microcosm of his own beliefs. Skepticism sounds a lot like non-dualism. The Greek skeptic Pyrrho, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy states that, quote, the Pyrrhonian skeptic has the skill of finding for every argument an equal and opposing argument, a skill whose employment will bring about a suspension of judgment on any issue which is considered by the skeptic, and ultimately tranquility. The skeptics. Shakespeare's fondness for perceptual confusion matches a fundamental principle of skeptical thought, explained by Paulita. The skeptic's argumentative repertoire emphasizes that sensory perception cannot provide a basis for certain knowledge. What about the sense of certain knowledge? So what does that mean for the sense of certainty? Is there a difference between certainty and the sense of certainty? It seems like it's the sense that founds the perception. Sensory perception. Is thought, is cognitive intellectualization a sense? Sensing? sense translation, sense transmission. Yeah, see, it's so interesting, and this is one of the hesitations I had regarding non-dualism in initially encountering it, which sort of proposes the same expression that nothing exists. Everything is just energy appearing to happen as what is perceived. And for a while, this was very hard for me to digest. And it still, to a degree, can be, but I also see a lot of, and feel within myself, a lot of validity in it, a lot of significance in that perception. And what's interesting is, as the quote unquote expression / argument would go, there is no you to experience passion. There is no you to experience logic. There is no logic. There is no passion. There is no you. It is just energy appearing to happen as you experiencing passion. And I feel like those perceptions can be simultaneously held, where it is both, where both can exist together, that nothing exists and nothing exists appearing to experience the persona of Samantha experiencing passion, experiencing logic, and none of that has to take away from the experience in and of itself. Nothing in that simultaneous holding has to remove the experience of joy and the experience of nothingness simultaneously. It doesn't have to necessarily erase, it doesn't have to eradicate one's perception of reality. It, at least in the experience here, has expanded it. I love this. But that is gorgeous point. Reason can be used to justify anything, and that the tool which the Eleatics and later Plato and Aristotle used, which was reason, can make an eloquent argument in favor of anything, including the seemingly ludicrous notion that there is no such thing as reality. Interesting. Reason is a fundamentally flawed tool because anything can be argued into anything. If you switched reason here with evidence, evidence is a fundamentally flawed tool because anything can be proof of anything. I don't know that I would necessarily consider it and qualify it as fundamentally flawed, perhaps more so narrowly tailored. And that narrow tailoring isn't all that has to be perceived to feel the sense of evidence, to feel and experience the sense of reason. There's a funness in it. Neither being nor not being exist, and as such, Gorgias equates them in the sense of being equally possible or impossible ideas. It's also interesting because the equal possibility and impossibility doesn't necessarily have to inform the experience of one's reality in a way that, how does this want to express? In a way that removes them from the equation. In a way that dampens and lessens the significance or the experience, the feeling of significance in themselves, the experience of validity within themselves, and fulfillment and satisfaction. Both the possibility and impossibility of these ideas can exist or not exist, and that doesn't necessarily have to inform the sense of fulfillment and satisfaction. And that's okay. And it's okay if it does. Yes. Wordplay is an essential aspect of the work of Shakespeare and I'm just going to say Gorgias, who were both obsessed with the philosophical implications of the polysemous nature of language. Yes, me too. Or at least I notice it quite often. And actually, the polysemous nature of language has often overwhelmed me to the point where there are times where I feel more comfortable in silence. And perhaps that's just an invitation to experience silence and to integrate that experience into the wholeness of being within a sense of peace, within a sense of being at peace with being silent. Interesting. A rhetorical figure called amphibole, an example of false reasoning. This kind of points towards the notion of conspiracy theorizing that is often kind of perceived with a negative connotation. But I feel like there's aspects of conspiracy theorizing that doesn't have that same flavor. That has more of a flavor of I'm not quite sure what other word to put on it other than truth. Scholar Scott Consigny is convinced that Gorgias was obsessed with excessively complex figurative language because he believed it was the only way to accurately represent an unrepresentable world. I love this. Gorgias relentlessly experiments with the style of utterance in the hope of producing genuine novelty, because language can never accurately imitate what is real. And he liked words that were strange, provincial, archaic, or obsolete, and that require a glossary in order to be understood. The sad contradiction of our existence is that we live only to die. No understanding of this can come from reasoning in ordinary non-figurative language, but the constant piling of paradox upon paradox may eventually leave us with an approximate notion of the extremity of the human condition. Ontogenic. And epistemic. Creating existence and creating knowledge. The word willingly is especially important. In viewing a play, or in the case of Gorgias, when watching a sophist perform a poem, one gives consent to believe or not believe in what is being presented. When we do believe what we see, it is called suspension of disbelief, because for the moment we enjoy the work, we give ourselves over to another reality. This actually reminds me of, I looked into, it's not agony, but it's agonistic. I looked into agonistic a couple videos ago in connection with the cell, auto-inducement, the numerical preference, conflict and tension. I'll have to look back at that, but I that's interesting that this is coming up again. And one of the reasons agonistic was interesting was because there is a sort of biological, when I looked it up, I believe there was a biological reference or a physiological reference. This is an interesting definition. To perceive all matters of the intellect, of life's seriousness, of necessities, even of danger as play. Gorgias' works reminds us over and over that we must not forget that there will always be alternative ways of construing the situation. Even more importantly, they were to be forever aware that what they had chosen as today's reality was ultimately a fiction. What is usually called language is actually all figuration. What this means is that we can't talk about anything without lying. And it is the job of the artist to remind people of this. But blaming post-structuralism for the supposed devaluation of truth is not the answer. We are told that the answer is to abandon fiction for truth and to embrace the newest, freshest, foundationalist philosophers when they posit that notions of right and wrong are self-evident and clearly enduring, and that reality never changes. Gorgias and Shakespeare, on the other hand, would posit that it makes more sense to distrust the man who says that there are immutable truths, especially if he claims he is in possession of them. it just kind of seems a bit ironic because of, you can argue the truth of anything, you can think the truth of anything, you can frame the truth of anything, whether through art or reason or silence, and it all, in expressing, points toward whatever and however it is received and given. And that goes beyond sort of the egoic sense of oneself, and that there is a sort of constant mutability in that. There's a constant mutability, and that sense of consistency, that sense of constancy also feels immutable to some degree. Very interesting. It's quite interesting. I'm sitting here about 2 hours or so after the last recording, and I'm noticing a rather depressed energy within the experience currently. And I leaned into it with the intention of exploring it. And what sort of came through was a potential connection to what I expressed regarding certainty and the interweaving of the perception and sense of certainty within the egoic sense of self and the identity thereof. So, how the egoic sense of self identifies to a large degree in a contained sense of certainty. And to have that sense of certainty feel elusive and feel unattainable has perhaps grounded within the body here an activation of what feels like a depressed energy, and to an extent, perhaps a little bit even of a grief. A feeling of hopelessness a little bit. And it is not certain whether how I am articulating this and what is being pointed toward is all that is contributing to this sensation I'm feeling. However, I did want to acknowledge its possibility. It does feel possible in a tangible way. And what I mean is that it feels more probable than a sense of sort of pure potentiality, as though it may not be evident in any other way than, or through any other form than how it is sensed in the body. And quite honestly, this might be a little bit of a sort of quote-unquote example of the experience of an evidentiary nature within sensation, and sensation sort of quote-unquote alone. It is interesting. I'm just leaning into it. I'm just sitting in it, acknowledging what it feels like, and finding it quite curious how this particular sensation and what was coming through came relatively soon after expressing about, certainty and the intimate connection with the egoic sense of self. And it's the egoic sense of self that is really feeling that sense of depressed, hopeless tiredness. So just to acknowledge it and give it the space to express, and take a deep breath.
And seasonal recipes. In addition, we dip our New York State filled apples and Oreo cookies, making fun novelties for our young visitors. Because our fudge is so popular, organizations finding a successful year-round fundraiser. While you're here, ask about our reason, visit our website, lifereadsinger.com. Now that we're done with our tour, let me fill you in on the rest of the display. Each piece is hand cut and wrapped and labeled and weighs about a half a pound each. And if you'd like a gift box, please help yourself. We're so glad you stopped here to taste our cards. And if you have any questions,
That isn't true for most people. It has a little sauce in there. I just saw it later. Yeah, I was at the bottom. I think at least what did you Oh no, I'm in that. Yeah, it's influence.